We didn't give much of a bio, but Terry's lone famous, world famous author, local historian, knows a lot about a lot. Wouldn't you say, Terry?
Yeah, I can lie about a lot. It's pretty close.
As long as it's believable.
Well, thank you all for having me here. I'm kind of at a makeshift podium here so I can get underneath the light. Well, let's see. I guess we'll start out by saying where my interest came about in Jeff Thompson. For one thing, I'm sure most of you have a pretty good idea who Jeff Thompson is, correct? But I don't know, believe it or not, it's been nearly 20 years ago that I first kind of got seriously interested in him and did a lot of reading and research. And at the time, I was thinking very seriously I might write a book about him, but somewhere along the line, I decided to move on to other projects, and basically I ended up just putting together a program like I'm doing tonight. And the first time I delivered that, it's hard for me to believe now, but it's like 20 years ago. And I did it a couple times after that initial presentation, and I haven't touched it since. When I was talking to Larry here about giving a presentation, I said there's some other books that I could give it on that probably be a little bit easier for me to do because they're recent things, but Jeff Thompson seemed to be the one that was most interesting, and so it took me about a day, but I finally dug out all my old notes and kind of put it together since then, so we'll see what we come up with here. Jeff Thompson, known as the Swamp Fox, was a brigadier general in the Missouri State Guard, the 1st Military District, which is southeast Missouri. He was famed as a guerrilla leader and also as a wordsmith, I guess would be the best way to put it. He loved to write and he loved to talk. And other than that, his sort of sheer flamboyance of character is part of what made him well known, famous. Most often he was described as being a colorful character. And because he seemed to be everywhere at once, why he was often called ubiquitous. Particularly Ulysses S. Grant is the one who was given credit for calling him that, saying he seemed to be everywhere at one time. Bruce Caton had a quote concerning Jeff Thompson. I'll just read it here. He said, Thompson rode about his camps on a spotted stallion named Sardanapalus, attended by a huge Indian orderly named Ajax. He cruised the river periodically in a tugboat, which he denominated as his flagship, and he wrote that the Confederate authorities could crush the St. Louis Unionists without trouble if they would just burn all the breweries and declare lager beer a contraband of war. So by this means the Dutch will all die in a week and the Yankees will then run from the state. I should mention that, even though he sounds pretty dramatic here in this, riding the spotted stallion and everything, but my research showed that as often as not, particularly when he was in the swamps, he's just as likely to be riding a mule. He thought they were more advantageous to use in that kind of terrain. As far as a description, this is one where he actually described himself, how he was dressed, and like I said, you got to remember that Jeff Thompson, among many other things, did not lack in ego. He said, I was dressed in a gray flannel shirt outside my pants with a red sash, a very large iron scabbard saber, and pistol and bowie knife in my belt. Gray camel pants stuck into short kip boots, a wool hat with a white plume on it. He said, making an altogether rather a rough appearance. But I don't know, it sounds kind of a dashing appearance to me, but anyway, let's see, I move on here. I'm trying not to read too many quotes because that sort of gets in the way of things here, but they're still interesting to read. As I said, colorful, ubiquitous. But some of the other phrases that were terms that were applied to him were eccentric, enigmatic, egotistical, energetic, and maybe most of all, effective. And that's just the E's. Also foolhardy, bold, dashing, harsh, resourceful. He sort of had a little bit of a mystic aura about him because of the way that he attacked unexpectedly and then disappeared. He was very popular, not only in Missouri, but throughout the South during the war, even though to a large degree that fame has not continued on down through the years. Part of the reason for that would be the remoteness of the scene of action in which General Thompson was engaged since the commencement of the war, and has prevented so full an account of his exploits being recorded in the newspapers as other leaders of his same class. When an authentic history of the Trans-Mississippi Campaign shall be written, the readers will be astonished at the magnitude of his exploits. A New Orleans correspondent wrote of him that with the exception of General Price, there's perhaps no man around whom Missourians would more enthusiastically rally than Jeff Thompson, if sent among them. He even managed to become a character in one of Mark Twain's books. His book that he wrote, for one thing, Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, was a personal friend of Jeff Thompson's. And in his book, The Gilded Age, he wrote, "You ought to know Jeff. He's one of the most enthusiastic engineers in the Western country, and one of the best fellows that ever looked through the bottom of a glass. There was nothing that Jeff wouldn't do to accommodate a friend. Mr. Jeff Thompson was the most popular engineer who could be found for this work." And we'll get into that a little bit more about his engineering and everything. Trying to keep things straight here.
Difficult with a stack of papers in it.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, I think we can move on from that now. That's kind of a general introduction. Back up here a little bit. There's been two different people in American history that have had that moniker, the Swamp Fox. And one of them, obviously, is Jeff Thompson. Do we know who the other one is? Anybody?
Francis Marion.
Francis Marion. That's right, the Swamp Fox during the Revolutionary War. And that's basically how he ended up with his moniker. He was known as the Swamp Fox of Confederacy, Missouri Swamp Fox, and the Francis Marion of Missouri. His early life, he was a descendant of two old Virginia families. He was born in Harpers Ferry, Virginia in 1826. He was named after his father, Meriwether. I never ran into anything that indicated what his actual middle name was. It may very well be out there someplace, but I never found it. But in his youth there, around his father and his mother's family were both basically employed there in Harpers Ferry at the arsenal. And matter of fact, his mother's family, his mother was a Broadus, who was a family related to the George Washington's family. Anyway, when he was a youth there playing around and having a good time, as kids will do there in the arsenal area, there was an old Negro man whose name was Jeff, and he drove a wagon there at the arsenal. And he was always riding around with Jeff on the wagon, and people started kidding him and calling him Jeff. And he decided he liked that name pretty well. So later on in Missouri, a number of years later, he had his name legally changed to M. Jeff Thompson. There's no Meriwether, it's just the initial M. So M. Jeff Thompson's official name as far as legally. And that's how he came about getting it. In 1847, he left for Liberty, Missouri to work in a mercantile firm. And this was after several attempts at a military or naval career, which for various reasons didn't work out. In Liberty, he met and married a woman named Emma Hayes, He later then moved to St. Joseph, also to work in mercantile. When the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad started being built east to west across Missouri, he joined the engineering party and started doing survey work for them. And by the time I don't know exactly how much education he had in that area, but he apparently rapidly acquired enough knowledge as a civil engineer during the time he worked there that he ended up making it his life's work. And by the time the western half of the Hannibal-St. Joe Railroad was built, well, he was in charge of construction. And so that was the beginning of his engineering career. And over the next 10 years or so after that, he had a long string of business successes and also political successes. Besides his railroad work, he eventually became the officer in 3 different railroads. He was the city engineer of St. Joe, he was the surveyor for Buchanan County, and he owned a real estate firm. And then in 1859, he was elected the mayor of St. Joe. And one of his last acts as the mayor of St. Joe was the opening of the Pony Express. He presided over that. And he was a colonel in the Missouri State Militia for Northwest Missouri. He also was an inventor. He held several patents, including a patent for a pistol that was, in many respects, similar to Colt's revolver. Within a year, though, of all these successes, he would end up leaving St. Joe and would never return again until his death in 1876. In 1861, he wrote a pamphlet basically calling for secession. He never personally ever owned a slave, but he did hold extremely traditional Southern views on slavery and states' rights. After Lincoln's call for troops, Thompson calls all of the Northwest Missouri militia troops to camp for training. But after the Harney-Price agreement, he leaves in disgust to return to Virginia and to fight, because the militia essentially was disbanded at that point. And the last thing that he actually did before he left St. Joe was crawl up on top of the post office and tear down the Union flag. And then he headed out of town. He continued on and got as far as Memphis on his way toward Virginia. And when he got into Memphis, he learned that the governor had called for 50,000 state troops to repel the Union forces. So he promptly returned to Missouri. But he never really got any further than southeast Missouri. So he decided to stay there and try for a local command rather than trying to get clear back to St. Joe. Ripley County in that part of the state asked him to head a battalion. Then General Nathaniel Watkins, who was commander of the 1st Military District, which is southeast Missouri, he resigned. And Jeff Thompson was then elected Brigadier General with 2,500 men in his command. So 2 weeks after essentially being a refugee from his own hometown, he was now Brigadier General commanding 2,500 troops.
Nice.
Yeah, nice work if you get it, right? Anyway, the southeast Missouri area was an extremely poor area, but it was an important area because of the importance of the Mississippi River. The terrain there was terrible. It was a quagmire in the forms of swamps, marshes, bogs, sloughs, overflow from rivers and creeks. And today, Jeff Thompson's successors in the Corps of Engineers have reclaimed and improved this area dramatically. But if you rode with Jeff Thompson back then, you would encounter a wet and colorful list of place names as they tried to find Union strongholds to raid. Included in this was the Mingo Swamp, the Negro Wool Swamp, St. Francis Swamp, Black Mingo Swamp, Gum Slough, Cash Swamp, Taylor Slough, St. John's Swamp, Willow Slough, and the list actually goes on. It was a wet area. These exotic sounding places made traditional military tactics nearly impossible, so instead Thompson went to guerrilla tactics, basically amounting to rapid movement, diversionary tactics, surprise attacks, misrepresentation of strength and intentions. His operation under those conditions proved very successful, and soon in print throughout the area and through the rest of the South, he had picked up the Swamp Fox name. During the remainder of 1861, the raids, skirmishes, and battles that he and his troops took a part of were Pattonville, Big River Bridge, Blackwater Station, Commerce, Fredericktown, and Bloomington, and New Madrid. He also raided Union supply lines and destroyed rail lines. His actions in the southeast part of the state caused such panic among the Unionists that it became a point of concern for the safety of St. Louis itself. Fremont and Grant both made his capture a priority. In 1862, he was ordered to report to General P.G.T. Beauregard at Corinth, Mississippi. He stopped in Memphis because the river defense fleet there, the Confederate river defense fleet, was in trouble. He apparently got permission from Beauregard to stay there and to be of assistance to that. So he volunteered himself and his troops to organize and man what was called the Cotton Boat Fleet. He was credited with the first naval victory for the South on the Mississippi River. He was later in charge of the Confederate lines around the city of Memphis and conducted intelligence operations in that area. And he came close to being captured many, many times. Eventually, when Memphis fell, he was among the last to leave Memphis, and he did it on a locomotive that he drove away himself. He was assigned then to Ponchatoula, Louisiana. His purpose there was to bother Union General Ben Butler in New Orleans. He had at that time probably around 200 men, but he announced that he intended to capture New Orleans. His threats, his rapid movements, his false claims to strength eventually convinced Butler that he had a force of around 10,000. This forced the Feds to leave Baton Rouge in order to reinforce Butler in New Orleans. And with that, except for New Orleans, the Confederates for a time had relatively free reign in the rest of the state. Eventually, in 1862, he went to Richmond to get a formal Confederate commission. Bear in mind, up until now, he has only been a brigadier general in the Missouri State Guard, even though he's been commanding Union or Confederate troops pretty much all along the way. So he went to Richmond to get a regular commission, and there was a large letter writing campaign that he did and other people on his behalf. P.G.T. Beauregard wrote a glowing letter saying he has to get a commission. And probably one of the biggest questions about Thompson is how he never wound up with the commission, because I've read a lot of times about the politics that went on, I guess, in all governments, but in the Confederacy, as far as commissions and things like that, there was a lot of political stuff. Quite frankly, there were some fairly shabby decisions made by some of the leaders. And if there was ever anybody that should have had a command, it was probably Jeff Thompson. But anyway, he was told that he must raise a brigade first. So he came back to try to do that, and he made a speech in Little Rock where basically, I guess, he criticized some of the Confederate superiors. And because of that, he was prohibited from recruiting in Missouri and Arkansas. So there was no way in the world that he was going to raise his brigade, and it's one of the few times where he probably shot his mouth off a little too much. In 1863, in southeast Missouri and in northeastern Arkansas, he served as an advisor on various expeditions that were led in the area, including one led by John Marmaduke. He built a bridge across the St. Francis River when a bunch of troops were trapped there, and he built that bridge in a single day so that they could get an escape. And then when they were all across the river, why, they destroyed the bridge and left the Union on the other side of the river when they got there about an hour after the fact. About this time, he was finally, once again, given the right to recruit again. And he was in the process of recruiting at Pocahontas, Arkansas, when he was captured on August 22nd, 1863. And after that, he was shunted around various federal prisons. First of all, he went to Grashaw Street in St. Louis, then the Alton Prison in Alton, Illinois, then Johnson's Island in Lake Erie in Sandusky, Ohio, Point Lookout, Maryland, Fort Delaware, and finally a prison ship in Charleston Harbor. He was part of the first 50 that were there. He was not part of what became known as the Immortal 600 because he was gone by that time. While he was in all these prisons, he received a lot of acclaim for his humanitarian help, his attempts to use his knowledge and his wordsmanship to keep up the spirits of the other inmates, and also for a number of escape attempts, none of which were successful. In 1864, he was exchanged for a Union general, so as far as the Union was concerned, he was a general because they exchanged a Union general for him. That was on August 3rd of 1864. By the late summer, he was back in southeast Missouri, and at that point in time, Sterling Price was on his raid and was out Pilot Knob, and he joined him there and stayed with Price throughout the rest of the raid through Missouri. In central Missouri, Colonel David Shanks, who was at that time was commanding General Joe Shelby's Iron Brigade. Shelby by that time had the division command. And anyway, David Shanks was seriously wounded. So Jeff Thompson was assigned command of the Iron Brigade of Cavalry. And while under his command, that brigade captured both Boonville and Sedalia as they pushed further west. Of course, they eventually went through Lexington, Little Blue, Independence, Big Blue, and Westport. And the Iron Brigade, in most of these instances, but particularly at Westport, they were leading the advance of the Confederate forces, and ultimately were the ones that stayed behind to cover the retreat. Price was defeated and retreated south through Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Indian Territory, and Texas. And during this time, Thompson was in charge of a whole division in spite of his lack of rank. In 1865, in Arkansas and Missouri, he was named commander of the northern subdivision of Arkansas, which was North Arkansas and most of Missouri. In that particular district, by that point in time, everything was pretty well crumbling and falling apart. Among his own troops, there was a real lack of morale, and the area was just running ripe with outright bandits, border raiders, jayhawkers had even gotten down that far. So in order to try to bring this under control, Thompson was given near dictatorial powers over everything and everybody in that area. And he was not one to step aside from those kind of duties, and he did some things that were somewhat distasteful to bring a situation under control there. Here's one fairly good idea of the kind of thing that he did. Try to pick up the thread of this. Okay, there was a fight. Okay, there was a fight, and a Lieutenant Colonel Dick Seckles had charged upon the enemy with the butt of a gun. It was met by a lieutenant. Dick knocked his sword out of his hand with his gun, and with the next blow brought him down and captured him. When the fight was over, they went together to hunt up the sword and found it, and the lieutenant placed it in his scabbard. Now, this is a Union lieutenant. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Seckles is a Confederate. He placed it in his scabbard. When we were getting ready to start, Dick asked the officer for his sword, and he declined to give it up. And Thompson was called over to investigate what was going on. He said, I asked the officer why he declined to give up the sword. He said that he did not consider us to be soldiers, that we were nothing but guerrillas dashing over the country, burning bridges and murdering people, and that he did not choose to give up his sword to such persons. I remarked very quietly, "My dear sir, I am sorry to differ with you. I think we are soldiers, and damn good ones at that, but you are entitled to your opinion and shall certainly have your choice in the kind of man you would have us be." I now called upon my Indian and said, "Ajax, that gentleman wishes to be treated as guerrillas treat their prisoners. Accommodate him." And at that point, Ajax immediately dismounted, drew his tomahawk, and advanced on him, waiting to see what his further orders were. And Thompson says, "I fully intended to let him kill him, as the other prisoners had heard the whole conversation, and I thought it would have a beneficial effect." But the prisoner saw his intention, and hastily unbuckling his belt, he ran to me, tendering the sword. I quietly told him to hand it to Colonel Sickles and told Ajax to put his tomahawk back. Should probably have backed this up a little bit further here, I think, than what I did, but I'll read it all later. Yeah, okay. Post-war, he was among the first to reconstruct and to facilitate reconciliation. He resumed his profession as a civil engineer. He went into business in Memphis and failed there, unfortunately. Then he went on to New Orleans in 1867 and became the chief engineer of the Board of Public Works. And while he was there, he made a lot of progress in improving the swampland around Louisiana, or around New Orleans in Louisiana. Unfortunately, the war itself, and particularly all the time he'd spent in the swamps, had basically ruined his health. He resigned his post to travel to totally improve his health. He made a trip back east in 1876 to attend the Centennial in New York City. And then he went back to St. Joe to visit friends and relatives. First time he'd been back since he left there. And his health worsened while he was there. He died September 5th, 1876, and was buried in St. Joe.
What was that date?
September 5th, 1876. And like I said, that is a fairly rapid run through of this guy. He's an extremely interesting person, not just because of all the things he did both before, during, and after the war, but because of the kind of individual he was. And like I said, pretty flamboyant. Back when he first became the brigadier general in southeast Missouri, or shortly after that, there was a proclamation issued out of St. Louis on August 30th of '61 by John C. Fremont. It says, "I do hereby extend and declare established martial law throughout the state of Missouri. The lines of the Army occupation in this state are for the present declared to extend from Leavenworth by way of post of Jefferson City, Rolla, and Ironton to Cape Girardeau on the Mississippi River. All persons who shall be taken with arms in their hands within these lines shall be tried by court-martial, and if found guilty will be shot. Real and personal property of those who shall take up arms against the United States or who shall be directly proven to have taken an active part with their enemies in the field is declared confiscated to public use, and their slaves, if they have any, are hereby declared free men. 3 days later, on September the 2nd, M. Jeff Thompson, the new Brigadier General commanding of that area, wrote his own proclamation. It said, "To whom it may concern, whereas Major General John C. Fremont, commanding the minions of Abraham Lincoln in the state of Missouri, has been fit to declare martial law throughout the whole state and has threatened to shoot any civilian soldier found in arms within certain limits, also to confiscate the property and free the Negroes belonging to the members of the Missouri State Guard. Therefore know ye that I am Jeff Thompson, Brigadier General of the 1st Military District of Missouri, having not only the military authority of Brigadier General, but certain police powers granted by the acting governor, Thomas C. Reynolds, and confirmed afterwards by Governor Jackson, do most solemnly promise that for every member of the Missouri State Guard or soldier of our allies, the armies of the Confederate States, who shall be put to death in pursuant of said order of General Fremont, will hang, draw, and quarter a minion of said Abraham Lincoln. While I am anxious that this unfortunate war shall be conducted, if possible, upon the most liberal principles of civilized warfare, and every order I have issued has been with that object, yet if this rule is to be adopted, and it must be first be done by our enemies, not by us, I intend to exceed General Fremont in his excesses, and will make all Tories that come in my reach rue the day that a different policy was adapted by their leaders. Already mills, barns, warehouses, and other private property have been wastefully and wantonly destroyed by the enemy in this district, while we have taken nothing except articles strictly contraband or absolutely necessary. Should these things be repeated, I will retaliate tenfold, so help me God. M. Jeff Thompson, Brigadier General.
Nice.
That is basically about all I intended to present here tonight. I've got tons of other material here and a lot of other quotes concerning him I could read, but this gives you a general overview of him and the kind of person he was. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. If you want to hear some more of these quotes, I could do that too.
Yes. You said, well, how was he related to the Swamp Fox, the Revolutionary War?
He wasn't related to it.
Okay.
He was just given the moniker because of where he fought and the
Okay.
kind of fighting that he did. You know, in other words, Francis Marion he was actually from South Carolina, I believe, but did most of his fighting in North Carolina. But he did a hit and run guerrilla thing on the British there in the swamps.
There's a Swamp Fox buried there on Crans Road in 72nd. I think it's that SAR.
Really?
Yeah.
No kidding. Did that guy ever end up here in Missouri that you know of? I guess.
Francis Marion?
Yeah.
No, not that I'm aware of.
That grave clearly says Swamp Fox, Revolutionary War.
I used to play in that cemetery, but I
Well,
wasn't looking.
maybe he rode with the Swamp Fox, maybe something like that, you know.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, he's in North Carolina, and Jeff Thompson's up there. And what is the cemetery?
Mount Mora. Mount Mora.
Yeah, that's
Mount
what I was
What's it
thinking.
called? Mount?
Mount,
Mora.
Moriah.
No, Mora.
How do you spell that?
Moriah, down home where I come from, and that's St. Joe.
It's M-O-R-A.
yeah,
M-O-R-A, in St. Joe. That was gonna be my
Yeah, it's
question.
right
Was
off
he
of
buried
Frederick
there?
Avenue.
yeah, it's right off Frederick.
Yeah, it's just like,
13th and Frederick, somewhere right in there.
Yeah, it's
it's
Mount,
like instead of Nevada, it's Nevada.
Yeah, exactly.
Is he hard to find, or?
No.
He's not real hard to find, but it's a pretty big cemetery, an old cemetery, and it kind of helps if you have some idea where you're
Yeah.
going. And, the thing I always thought is that, I don't know what was put there initially when he was buried, but somewhere along the line, somebody put a slab kind of thing over the top of his grave, only it was done really cheaply. It was almost like some poured concrete, but, you know, they inscribed a lot of the stuff here that he did on it, which is good. But I always thought it'd be great if, you know, some money got raised to put up a lot better.
Well, he's got
Mark?
he's got a Confederate headstone.
Yeah, he has a Confederate headstone. Did he have, is there an original headstone that they
Just
put up
that,
when he was
that
buried?
big flat one.
Just, yeah, but, and that I'm pretty sure was done later, you know, but I'm not sure exactly. You know, and like I said, it's, I don't know, what would you call it? It's almost folk art, you know, or something like that, you know, the way it's done.
But he was not one of the immortal 600. I was thinking he was.
Well, he was right there, but he was paroled or exchanged before that actually occurred. A lot of people think that that's the case just because he was there, but there was about 50 guys that were there before the 600 were brought in later and everything. If he had been exchanged, he would have been part of the immortal 650, I guess,
Sure.
or whatever, you know.
Heck yeah.
Yeah.
Was anybody actually hung, drawn, and quartered?
Not that I'm aware of. I wouldn't, I know that for a fact, and I didn't get into this, that Jeff Thompson sentenced a lot of people to be executed, and they were in fact executed. But I don't know or if any of them were hung, drawn, and quartered. Probably some of them hung. Most of them, I think, were shot, the people.
Or both.
What?
Or both.
Or both, yeah. Anybody else, any questions? Yeah.
Did he surrender to General Dodge?
I believe that that's correct, John. I know that he and Dodge eventually became pretty good friends and everything, and of course, yeah, that's another thing that's sort of surprising, since he knew Dodge, and I think you're right, I think that's who he technically surrendered to. Dodge, almost immediately after the war, became the main driving force of the Union Pacific Railroad for the Transcontinental Railroad. And given Thompson's background in railroading, I'm somewhat surprised that he didn't get involved with the Union Pacific Railroad. And but I've never really seen anything to sort of account for that. But
Old feelings might have died hard.
well, I think so. Yeah, it could be that, hey, this was a Yankee deal, you know, and he didn't want to get involved. There was one other point here I was going to make. I think I might have skipped on past that.
He
Yeah.
should have went to the Southern Railroad. Brigadier General James Thaddeus Holtzclaw was one of the people who helped start the Southern Railroad in Alabama. He was born in McDonough, Georgia, but Thompson should have went down there. I'm a former engineer for Union Pacific Railroad, and my seniority was Kansas City to Omaha. Dodge Street is one of the main streets anyway there in Omaha.
That's
Yeah.
true.
Pacific Railroad.
Yeah, and I've gone over to, his name is Grenville Dodge, General Grenville Dodge, and I've been over to his house that's over there in Council Bluffs. It's a nice museum and everything, and you know, he was a major figure after the war for certain. And of course, the people from the Central Pacific coming the other direction from California, they eventually they founded the Southern Pacific Railroad and built, you know, the Southern line, because there were several transcontinental railroads built after the first one. As a matter of fact, the war itself had a big part to do with why that road was built where it was built. If it would have been much more sensible and ideal for the most part to have built a southern route instead of going through all the mountains and stuff that they had to go through to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But at the time that the funding was going on, which was essentially right in the middle of the Civil War, there was no way in the world that anybody was going to say, yeah, it's a good idea to put this road across the South. That ain't going to happen. So instead, you know, they dug 1,000-foot-long tunnels through granite and everything else, you know, in order to get it done. But Anyway, like I said, I don't know what his proclivities played a part in his not being part of that or not, but I did kind of skip over this one. I'll go back to that. In the spring of '65, he was actually given an order to surrender. Lee had been defeated, Lincoln had been assassinated, and he was hardcore. He opposed that order to the bitter end, but was eventually forced to comply. He actually was taking part in 2 different surrender/parole sessions in late May and another in early June. He eventually made his a farewell speech to his troops, and at that point in time, he was pretty well disillusioned with a lot of the remaining people that were part of the Southern cause. And, you know, I think he thought that there was just a lot of real low-grade individuals that were left. You know, a lot of the good ones had died off and everything. You know, and in other words, like I said, when he was given all that dictatorial powers, why he had a huge problem with his own troops. But anyway, in his farewell speech, he basically told them, "Look, you know, we've lost. So obey the law, cooperate with the authorities, work hard." He said, "Avoid the nigger question, and let all of the no-goods in this army have it with both barrels." You know, he obviously, didn't like all of his men by the end of the thing, although he was highly respected all throughout the war. So anyway, that's about all I've got, unless there's other questions or unless somebody wants to hear a whole bunch of quotes from all kinds of sources and books and articles and
Well,
stuff.
he is an author, so he has brought a plethora of books over here.
Yeah.
He's told me a little bit about a couple of them, and one of them I think sounds pretty good, and it's a novel. It's nonfiction, it's a fiction,
Yeah.
but it's based on his relatives down in the Oklahoma Territory
No,
before
that
it was
one
a
is real.
state.
That one's factual. The Oklahoma Territory.
Oh, sorry. Well, anyway, it sounds good, and it's sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, anyway, yeah, I do have books over there, 7 different books. I've got some CDs over there about the Rebel Yell, and I've also got some handout sheets about M. Jeff Thompson there that, I don't know, there's not enough probably for everybody, but if anybody's interested and wants to pick up one of them there, why, they're welcome to it. And if you do want to buy a book, whatever the price marked on any of them there, I'll give you $2 off of it here for tonight, except for the CD. The CD I got to sell at the price it is because otherwise I go in the hole on it.
Right.
But the others are, I can knock a couple dollars off for you guys. And anyway, yeah, I think there's books there that you will enjoy. And, I've told Larry that in the future I'd be glad to come back and talk about a couple of those that are probably not as directly pertinent to the war and the Confederate cause as the talk here tonight, but I still think, you might find some of them interesting and everything, so.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, that's about it, unless there's anything else.
Ready for break and give him a hand?
Yeah, man.
All right.